In this episode of International Reporters Roundtable, the war in Ukraine. In the US, there's hot debate over how much military aid is enough. President Zelenskyy's star is starting to lose some of its shine. People want to know how long this is going on and what happens if support for Ukraine stops. Our guests Andrei Illarionov, James Lechner, and Will Richardson join us to discuss the true nature of the war in Ukraine. Welcome to International Reporters Roundtable. I'm your host, Cindy Drukier. Our conversations bring together journalists and experts from around the world. They help us uncover hidden information and details of conflicts, alliances, and connections in a deep dive discussion. This week, the war in Ukraine. It's dragged on far longer than most of us expected, over a year and a half now. And likewise, the information war also rages on. From all sides. It's normal in times of war, but it does make it hard to know what to believe. What's the real status of the war? Is all that aid money being well spent? What interests are winning and what are losing? Where are we going next and where does this end? One thing we do know is that Ukraine's fight is being sustained by foreign aid from the US and other mostly European allies. But support for continuing that aid is waning in the US. There's been a feud in Congress over more dollars for Ukraine. And in a recent CNN poll, 55% of Americans say Congress should not authorize more funding. In Europe, countries close to the conflict, like Poland, have their own worries. Will Putin send troops to their borders? And what's the situation inside Russia? Are sanctions having an impact? Is there support for this prolonged special military operation? Finally, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelenskyy. His recent tour to the UN and Washington shows the shine on his star power is somewhat diminished, but he still has the world's attention. Today, we go to the source. We go behind the scenes with insights from Ukraine, Russia, and Poland. Time to meet our panel. Our guests today are Dr. Andrei Illarionov. He has a doctorate in economics from St. Petersburg State University and was Vladimir Putin's chief economic advisor from 2000 to 2005. Also Putin's personal representative at the G8. Under Andrei's leadership, Russia doubled its GDP. Then, in 2005, he resigned and became an outspoken critic of Putin and the Kremlin. Last month, his former government put him on its foreign agency registry. Now, Andrei is the senior analyst for Russia and European affairs at the Center for Security Policy and head of the program at the Ukrainian Institute for the Future. He's written 3 books and over 1,000 articles. Andrei, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting.
Next, we have Will Richardson, a war correspondent, writer, and producer. His investigative work and war reporting have taken him to the Balkans, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. He now lives in Warsaw, Poland, where he hosts a popular weekly talk show, There's a Will, in English, making it a rarity in Central Europe. He also hosts a second show, Poland Daily Travel. Will has been broadcasting from Poland throughout this war, and today he joins us from the World for Ukraine Summit in southern Poland, just 60 miles west of the Ukraine border. Will is a returning guest from our very first episode of IRR. Will, welcome back.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here.
Finally, we have James Lechner, another returning guest. Jim is a veteran Army infantry officer with 27 years of service, 8 deployments, including to Somalia, made famous by the book and film Black Hawk Down. He wrote his own memoir about it too, called With My Shield. His leadership roles in Iraq were also captured in the books A Chance in Hell and A Soldier's Dream, and in the film American Sniper. Jim has a master's degree in history. He's advised the National Security Council at the White House and the CIA. And he's freshly back just 2 weeks from the Ukrainian front, where he's been a war correspondent for NEWSMAX. Jim, welcome back.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Jim, I'm going to start with you since you just returned from the front lines and the focus of our talk today is the war in Ukraine. From the reports we get, it seems that there's a bit of a stalemate. Even NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, who has just made a surprise trip to Kyiv, was talking about territorial gains in terms of meters. So what is the current state of the war from Ukraine's perspective? What does it look like on the front?
Well, I'd say that's a very good topic to lead off with. The information or the perceptions that people are getting from the war are very distorted. There's very little accurate information coming out, even from the media. It's just not being covered. There's no one up there. From the U.S. government perspective, they're just taking the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense information that they're getting. And obviously, the Ministry of Defense has a job to do to try to paint support for Ukraine's efforts. So, unfortunately, that's accurate. It's very much a stalemate. The Ukrainians have long been touting this counteroffensive that they've been getting ready to mount and then mounted this summer, and it's really only gaining kilometers. The units that we were with are fighting and dying for just about 100 meters. It's extremely difficult up there at the front. The Russians are proficient in the defense, and they've learned a lot from last summer, and it's a much different Russian military force that they're facing out there. Another quick point I'd like to make on that, while we're focused on the Ukrainian counteroffensive, focused in the south and in the east where I was at, the Russians remain on the offensive along about 60% of the line. The line is about hundreds of miles long, extending from Zaporizhzhia up to Kharkiv, and the Russians remain on the offensive in many areas there. We'll continue to see a high level of military operations throughout the winter, is my prediction.
Okay, Andrei, let's go to the Russian side of the conflict. You know your former boss quite well, and you know Russia's fighting capabilities. You know, the propaganda war is also raging, as I mentioned in the intro. I believe about 5%, you know, of what comes out. So tell us, what do things look like from Russia's perspective? How is the war progressing from their side? What are the plans?
Just a few days ago, the Kremlin has unveiled plans to increase military expenditure from the 2 days very high level to even higher level. So still, there is no exact numbers because it is some kind of secret information, but based on indirect knowledge, we can say easily that military expenditure on annual basis running at probably 120, 150 billion US dollars a year, and is going to be increased at least by 40% next year. As for the public support for the war, it is still very high. Based on the data from independent poll organizations, it's probably between 70-75% right now. So, and based on anecdotal evidence, we do not see any substantial fall in support of this aggression against immediate neighbor.
Do you feel we can trust those polls? I often wonder when I see polls coming out of Russia.
I think I'm talking about the so-called Levada Center, which is probably the only independent polling center which is not financed by the Russian government, and it also claimed to be foreign agents like me. So that is why among those polling organizations, if we can have any trust to anyone, so it would be Levada Center would be number one. Based on anecdotal evidence, I would say, generally speaking, the support for the war between, let's say, 2/3 to 3/4 of populations is reasonably correct.
And lastly, quickly, who are the soldiers on the front lines right now, and what's their, enthusiasm for fighting?
It depends. Certainly, some do express this enthusiasm, as you are saying. Some maybe not too much, but as already Dean said correctly, that many of them are more or less professional people, and they are fighting for their own survival, and that is why they need to be professional. They need to fight well, just first of all to survive. So we are seeing two armies that, by their level of training, are of approximately similar level. Certainly, Ukrainians do have much stronger enthusiasm because they're defending their own country, their own lives, their own nation from genocidal attacks from Putin's regime. But nevertheless, in terms of the quality of personnel, quality of military personnel, or quality of military commanders, I would say it's reasonably comparable.
Okay, and Will, I'd like the view from you from Poland, especially. Poland recently announced it was going to stop military aid to Ukraine. It wasn't totally clear if this was to prepare its own military for war or because of some disputes with Ukraine. So particularly, let's talk first in the Polish government. What is the view of the war and support for Ukraine at the moment?
I mean, there'll be no flagging of support from the Polish government, this Polish government, should they win the election in 2.5 weeks. But the point is, you cannot ask Poland to bear the brunt of the grain issue. That's what's really at the bottom of this.
Before it could start shipments.
Issue, yes,
voicing concerns that.
And most of it's coming through Poland because, as everyone knows, the boats in the Black Sea are blockaded by Russia. We'll see how long that lasts. I believe that Turkey will be getting involved soon, what I'm hearing, to open up those channels. We shall see. But the government here is very much behind the war, but they're not going to bankrupt their farmers, especially with a policy right before an election. It's not very wise. I mean, Poland, or very practical, because Poland has a peasant economy, very similar to France. They have the two most agriculturally based economies in the whole of the EU. Poland, for example, is second in cattle production after Ireland. Surprisingly, Ireland's number one, perhaps to some people. So I don't think, even if the opposition were to win, I don't think there's going to be a discontinuing or a leveling off of Polish support for the Ukrainians against the Russian invasion. And let's face it, it is an invasion. There's no way around that. However you may characterize Mr. Putin, he's got pretty sticky fingers, and now those fingers have got a lot of blood on, and it's innocent blood. At the forum here, the World for Ukraine Forum, I can't tell you how sickening it is to see what has happened to children. I talked to a number of organizations.
Okay, I'm gonna hold you. I'm going to hold you right there because I'm going to ask about that specifically, and we're just on a break now. So we're going to take a little break, and then when we come back, we're going to hear more about the true nature of the war in Ukraine from Poland, Russia, and Ukraine. Welcome back to our panel on the state of the war in Ukraine with our guests Andrei Illarionov, Will Richardson, and James Lechner, sharing their wisdom. Gentlemen, welcome back. So I'd like to talk about, go back to the front lines a little bit more, Jim, or actually the situation in Ukraine. We're just hearing about how things are going in Poland, and I'll get more back to that as well. But what's it like in the rest of Ukraine? So how much of the country is under direct conflict? What is life like in Kyiv and other places that are far from the front? And what's the mood for Ukrainians? Our families have been separated now for 1.5 years. Are people still leaving? Are they coming back? What does it look like?
Well, surprisingly, most of Ukraine has recovered as far as the shock of the war. And for example, when I went to Kyiv, the population was down to about 15% back in March of 22. It's largely recovered. Most of the restaurants and businesses are open. People are thriving. I tell people that you're really not going to feel much of the war until you get up to about within 20 kilometers of the front. Now, having said all that, every Ukrainian's lives has been touched deeply by this. Everyone I know has people serving in the military. They've lost husbands and fathers and brothers. There's a prisoner of war problem. Many prisoners still unaccounted for on the Ukrainian side, being captured in Russia or missing at the front. So again, it's taken a great toll on Ukrainian society. Again, the airstrikes, while the country is in great shape as far as infrastructure at this time and people are thriving, the airstrikes continue. And that's a lot of mental pressure, if nothing else, on people. The Russians are using cruise missiles. They're using drone attacks, and those types of things are taking a toll on people mentally. But morale remains high. That's almost one of the problems, is that they expect to liberate every inch of their territory. And there's going to be a reckoning with reality here, I think, by the end of the winter with that, as far as that goes in morale.
Okay, that's interesting. We'll get back to that later because I want to see where everyone thinks that this is going. Andrei, what is the impact on the Russian economy? Sanctions were supposed to, cripple Russia. They're spending lots on this war. What does it look like there? What's the impact? And how are people experiencing the situation?
Okay, first of all, I need to say that I cannot report from Russia. I'm a little bit outside of Russia. For me, it would probably not be wise to be in Russia for the moment. As for your question, and concerning these sanctions that have been discussed intensively over the last year and a half, those sanctions that have been enforced by the United States and European Union had very opposite impact compared to what expected. Instead of limiting Russian economy and Russian finance in pursuing this war, those sanctions, because they have been mistakenly designed, produced very opposite result. As a result of those sanctions, Russian GDP last year, year 2022, did not decline but increased, and increased by whopping 21% in dollar terms. Last year, Russian GDP has happened to be the largest in history of Russia, the largest historically record size not only of GDP but of Russian export of oil, gas, and all other energy products, almost 400 billion US dollars, record total export from Russia, record government revenues, record government expenditures, and record government expenditures on military issues, which is being used against Ukraine. Last year, military expenditures of Russia are 3 times higher than they were in the last pre-war year, 2021. And 23 is going to be even higher, and 24 is going to be even higher. And one of the reasons for that unbelievable increase in all those indicators are very wrongly designed sanctions from the United States and European Union. We can discuss it, but essentially, instead of addressing the Russian export, especially Russian export of energy, those sanctions addressed import. As a result of that, it produces a boost for the Russian foreign exchange reserves, for Russian exchange rate, and for the Russian economy, and for the prices on energy markets. Unfortunately, even this mistake became obvious even last spring. The governments in the United States, Canada, European Union, and other countries continue this wrong policy by supporting Russia, because those sanctions did bring Putin an additional 400 billion US dollars. That those money Putin is using in the war against Ukraine first and against Russian opposition second. So that is why it's unbelievable story that the Western countries, Western leaders do support efforts of Putin in this war.
Those are pretty shocking numbers, I have to say. And just very quickly, who are Russia's biggest trading partners?
Now, Russia is actually trading with almost all countries. It's a huge country with diversified economy, certainly China, India, European countries. So all of Middle East, Latin America, all those countries are trade partners for Putin's Russia.
And Will, what is the mood in Poland in terms of concerns and other neighboring countries? I was in Poland about a year ago, and friends I had there, everyone was keeping their cars full of gas. They all had their passports on the ready, cash ready. What's the mood right now?
I did too. So on occasion, yeah. We had what was called a go bag in case. Well, everybody was a lot more worried about the possibility of something radical, and possibly nuclear back then. A lot of rumors going around, but I don't think people aren't talking about that now. Doesn't mean it can't still happen, but it's not something that people are talking about. In many ways, I would suppose that the governing mood right now is war fatigue more than anything else. And indeed, that was the closing panel today at the World for Ukraine Congress, which I just came from to do this interview and join these gentlemen. And so I would say that right now, there's a kind of stability. And also, I noticed, stability of mood. But also, I noticed that the kind of people, there was another one of these, the first edition of World for Ukraine was last December. And there were a lot more people there, and the mood was a lot different. You know, you had all the refugees to deal with and everything that goes with taking care of that many people, which was, unbelievable sort of Dunkirk operation, as everyone knows. But that's all gone. So now it's more the geopolitical reality is setting in. And no one here in Poland believes that it's in Poland's interest not to back Ukraine, to have stronger ties with Ukraine, with the Baltic state, indeed with Europe as a whole, particularly Britain, Great Britain, United States, and the Scandinavian Nordic countries. There is a particular axis there that's developing. It's been predicted for some time, but it's developing. There's no doubt about it.
Okay,
so
we're hitting up another break here, so I will come right back. We'll take a break and we'll return right back with our panel to discuss more about the situation in Ukraine. Welcome back. This is International Reporters Roundtable. I'm your host, Cindy Drukier. Let's return to our panel. Jim, I want to come back to you and ask you what things look like on the front. I want to talk about the money being spent, because I mentioned earlier that there is some fatigue in the U.S. about sending more and more money over to Ukraine. What does that money look like on the front?
Well, that's a great question. But if I could just kind of set some context, I think Russian propaganda is extremely effective in the United States, perpetuating this idea embraced by some conservatives that there's just pallets of money being handed to Kyiv and all kinds of new weaponry just rolling off the ships and things and trains in Kyiv. That's absolutely not true. The fund is actually provided. The U.S. government has the fund and maintains it. When they send equipment and ammunition over to the front, then they come out of that fund and buy replacements for the U.S. military. So it's a huge misconception of how the funding is working. There's certainly operational funds for the government, but that's separate from the military aid. And surprisingly, what we've seen at the front, it's really an inadequate, execution by the Biden administration. The ammunition is trickling in. The Ukrainians remain outgunned and not have enough ammunition across the board. The ammunition is trickling in. And I'll give you another example. They promised M1 Abrams tanks. Well, they won't even arrive till next year. The counteroffensive will be long over by that time. So a lot of negligence and poor execution on the Biden administration. And what we're seeing at the front in many cases is you'll get some old weapon systems or old ammunition that the U.S. clears out of the warehouse and send it up to the Ukrainians. I've seen corroded Javelin batteries. I've seen them fizzle where they don't work. Now, that's not across the board. There's certainly some good things coming like the HIMARS and the 7.7. But even in these cases, the Ukrainians try to highlight they're not getting the full capability of those weapon systems. I'll give you an example. The 7.7 artillery piece, 7.77, is based on a digitized fire control system. When you see those guns in Ukraine, all the boxes are empty. They didn't sell the digitized piece. So you get about 2,000 more meters out of the gun. So that's just an example of what's going on. Ukraine is being supported by the West, but in my view, inadequately. When they need air defense, they need counter drone systems. They need better drone systems across the board. The Russian Air Force has reappeared. And so again, air defense is a critical piece, not just against cruise missiles.
I think I saw on the news those tanks were starting to arrive. Let me ask you, is there any concern about diversion of weapons? Because in July, we had the Pentagon Inspector General's report came out via FOIA request from military.com, and it showed, at least in the first half a year of the war, that there was some theft going on. So some of the machinery, some of the hardware wasn't making it to the Ukrainian soldiers. It was being stolen by Russian gangs of all things. What's the oversight look like right now? Is this a possibility that this is going on?
Well, there's two problems with that. First, there are no U.S. military or U.S. government representatives beyond Kyiv. And if you're in Kyiv, you might as well be in Berlin or San Francisco for that matter. You're not going to see where the rubber meets the road or where the weapons are actually being administered. I can't speak to the report of Russian groups stealing weapon systems. What I can tell you happens from a natural bureaucratic perspective is as those weapon systems come across the Polish border, they get taken by units, Ukrainian units that are in Western Ukraine. So one of the huge complaints that we hear from the front, like in the Eastern Donbass, is the best equipped units in the Ukrainian military are all in Lviv, right on the Polish border. And so that's one of the problems that they have right now is a bureaucratic aspect. These weapon systems just aren't making it to the front. I do know for a fact the Ministry of Defense and the Zelenskyy administration are taking active measures to counter that. It used to be you could buy personal items and have them shipped in to support your unit. Now the Ministry of Defense is taking centralized control of that in an effort to try to get the things that going to the right places at the right time. But again, the U.S. has no idea of what's going on because they don't have anyone at the front. They just let the Army attaché personnel come to the embassy in August. And again, that's just the embassy in Kyiv, and they treat it like a green zone. They're not allowed to leave there. So they really don't have a clear picture of what's going on.
And Andrei, there's considerable money being spent over, at least from American taxpayers' point of view, when we look at the polls. At least there's been asks over and over again whether or not the dollar amounts are as massive as some people think. What happens if that money dries up? What happens if the U.S., if favor for supporting Ukraine fails, declines so much that money stops or at least diminishes?
First of all, I need to say, just to continue what Tim was saying, that the amount of military aid that the United States provided to Ukraine that is being used widely in the United States are generally incorrect. We've heard that several presidential candidates are using this number, like several hundreds of billions of US dollars or 200 billion US dollars. Many people are using number 113 billion US dollars of aid provided to Ukraine. Washington Post published an article in August claiming that military aid to Ukraine happened to be at 66 billion US dollars. All these numbers are incorrect. What is important just to have a very clear distinction between three levels of aid to Ukraine. First, appropriation by the US Congress. Second, commitment of the US administration. And third, physical delivery of military aid to the territory of Ukraine. So that is why we need to understand what we are talking about. The total appropriation of the US Congress for military aid to Ukraine is 48 billion US dollars, not more. Not 70, not 60, not hundreds, not at all. 48 billion, this is an appropriation. Commitment of the US administration, of Biden administration to Ukraine at this moment, 44 billion US dollars. And physical delivery of military aid from the US to Ukraine, to the territory of Ukraine, as of today is 19.8 billion US dollars, less than 20 billion US dollars.
Just to confirm, we're just talking about the military aid, is that right? Not the humanitarian and financial aid?
Just only military aid, yes. But this is a crucial one. Just to sustain military operations on the front. So this is the most important part of aid that US can provide to Ukraine. So this 19.8 billion US dollars that United States has physically delivered to the Ukraine is not enough. It's so-called creep dropper level. Russia is spending 6, 7, 8 times more on monthly basis or on daily basis through these annual operations. And this goes against the accepted by the United States military doctrine. Just to get parity on the front line, you need to get something close to the parity in the military finance. That was the story of the First World War, of the Second World War, of Korean War, of Vietnam War, of all other military conflicts in which the United States was involved during the last century. This is the only and unique case in the history where the United States either participates itself or helps partner or ally, in which the United States deliberately has chosen not to support ally and partner at the level that would achieve what would be close to parity. It is several times less than it is necessary just to be able to sustain attacks from the Russian side. This is a shocking fact, and that is why, without those military aid, Ukrainians are paying this price, this difference, with lives of military personnel and with lives of civilians who have been bombarded by missiles, by drones, by all the attacks of the Russian aviation and so on. So this is a bloody equation that everybody should understand, that each missile, each shell that is not delivered to Ukraine, it means additional death of Ukrainians.
And from what you said earlier...
That's a great point. If I could I jump in for a second?
Go right ahead, Will.
That's a great point, and I wish I'd made it myself. But the other thing is that the will of the Ukrainians has not, here's an important point, the will of the Ukrainians has not been dented, even though the supplies came in late, and even though, because those supplies, those military supplies came in late, the Russians were able to dig in. I mean, that's why the offensive isn't working, folks, because the military aid came in too late. It's still too late. And the reason Ukrainian people say, oh, they had the breakthroughs last autumn and the end of last summer, and the reason that's not happening now is because the Russians had time to dig in over the winter. So it's all of those people, as our Russian colleague has pointed out, a lot of those casualties are those people are disappearing from life, because that's what it is, because they were not supplied properly. If you're going to do this thing, you've got to do it right. And it's in the interest of the United States, geopolitically, to subdue its allies here and now. Not only makes sense in contemporary geopolitics, but it makes sense based on the historical record of Russia invading into Central Europe. Okay? Anybody wants to pick up a book, they can go back and start with Ivan the Terrible and come to the present day and see a history of aggression by the Russians towards Western Europe. Okay, that's all I wanted to say. And I'm so glad that point was made. It's really true.
Okay, we're going
if I may add,
we're just going to take a break. We're going to take a break, and then I'll come right back to you. I promise. We're going to take a break, and then we'll return to our panel on the situation in Ukraine. Welcome back. This is International Reporters Roundtable. I am your host, Cindy Drukier. And now we return to our panel about the truth of what's going on in Ukraine with Andrei Illarionov, Will Richardson, and Jim Lechner. Okay, I cut you off before the break. Andrei, go ahead and make your point.
I just wanted to remind the interview that Commander of Armed Forces of Ukraine, General Zelenskyy, gave about a few months ago, in which he said that if he does not receive about 100,000 shells per week, so it means the death of 100 of military personnel. So I calculated the total amount of shells of all calibers that the United States has supplied to Ukraine over this 19 months war, and I arrived to the number 44,000 per week, which means a lack or deficit of supply of shells is 56,000, which means that according to the formula of General Zelenskyy, it might be up to 560 military personnel of Ukrainians additional excess deaths per week as a result of inadequate supply of ammunition, of military techniques, of all other military aid from the United States and other parties.
Jim, let me ask you, Zelenskyy just fired Reznikov, his defense minister, and cleared house in the defense ministry. We only really hear about Zelenskyy. We know that oligarchs always play a central role in Ukraine. It's been a country accused of high levels of corruption for many, many years. So what role, what else is going on in Ukraine that we need to understand?
Well, I always think that's a very ironic charge, especially by conservatives here in the U.S. When you look, we have impeachment process going on again of our presidential administration. And I haven't met one person in Ukraine that challenges the election of President Zelenskyy. They all see that as legitimate, where many people that I know in the United States challenge the legitimacy of this administration. So the charges of corruption and an illegitimate government, I always find take with a grain of salt against the Ukrainians. One of the things that I think is going on is not so much a firing of the last Minister of Defense, but a replacement. I think he's moving on to some more ambassadorial role. Don't quote me on that. But there is a different disposition with this Ministry of Defense. And I started to allude to before, there's great efforts being taken to try to streamline the procurement process and the resupply process. All of the Deputy Minister of Defense were replaced. And again, that's just a change of administration, the new guy bringing in his people. And what I'm being told is that's going to look at not only streamlining and making the process more efficient, as we talked about before, but also to assist with some of these negotiations and some of the things that are going on in regards to grain and economics and the military reality on the battlefield.
Okay. Tim, I want to go back to you. We're going to start running out of time here, and I really want to get to the child trafficking that you raised earlier and other things that you may have learned at this conference that are not military related, but that we need to be looking out for and paying attention to in Ukraine.
Yes. Okay. The treatment of children has been absolutely appalling. Anyone who's for isolationism, who thinks that America shouldn't be the guiding spirit anymore, and the Western democracies, I have to say, is sadly myopic and mistaken. The toll on the human beings in Ukraine who have needlessly been deported, imprisoned, wounded, 50 to 60,000 people without limbs, and dead is appalling and should not be allowed. The whole world should have stood up against this and said it cannot happen when the Russians, before the Russians ever invaded. A strong response, and the obvious strength of the world at that time, united, would have stopped this invasion. It was weakness that provoked, as it always does with autocratic regime. Make no mistake about it. Again, don't believe me. Please take one of those books that might be on the shelf with our Russian colleague there, and look at history. For plenty of backup on that. Okay, so Poland is still doing great things to incorporate Ukrainians into its own society and into employment. There's very little friction between people in the street. Ordinary, you never see any problems like that. So it's absolutely, I can't stress how much of a miracle it is to take 2 million people and just suddenly put them in your country. And there's no, societal repercussion. Okay, that's one thing. The other thing that we are looking at, okay, you want to come back to the grain thing. I want to address that because it really is at the bottom of the present controversy that's been in the press and that isolationists have leapt upon, saying that even the Poles are backing out. They're not. It's just that the world needs this grain. So it should be at least a European-wide response to shoulder the responsibility of disseminating the grain, even if that means at some point subsidizing it a bit, to move it at least. That's not simply a Polish problem. You can't put everything on Poland, which is the main conduit for all the arms going. So anybody who thinks Poland hasn't put a commitment, go back and look at the facts. Poland has gone so far and above and beyond the call of duty that it's almost miraculous for the reasons before mentioned. And also, remember that 35 years ago, or 34 years ago, in 1989, Poland was under Russia. Gosh, why would they maybe not want to be they might fear the Russians now.
Right.
I mean, come on.
Okay, we're good. We're moving.
Also, one other point.
Sure.
Go ahead if you want to interrupt. Go ahead.
Well, what I'd like to do is get to, we're heading up towards the end of the show, and I want to hear from everybody where you think this is going. I mentioned earlier that Jens Stoltenberg, Secretary General of NATO, was just in Kyiv, and Zelenskyy came out of that saying it's just a matter of time that they'll be formally part of NATO. So I want to hear where you think this is going. When does it end? Is talk of NATO helpful, the right thing right now? I'll start with you, Jim.
Yeah, I personally don't think that's going to happen. I don't think Ukraine's going to be brought into NATO for a variety of reasons. The conflict is not going to end. While the conventional fighting is going to obviously end at some point, the conflict will not. President Putin has stated, part of his policy is to bring all Russian-speaking peoples back under the sphere of influence of Russia. And so that obviously extends far beyond Russia and Ukraine and other areas. So the conflict, the asymmetric aspects of this conflict, which really started in 2014, are not going to end with the end of conventional operations. And I don't think bringing Ukraine into NATO will help, address that situation. So I think as far as the next 6 months to a year, I think this counteroffensive that we're seeing being attempted by the Ukrainians is going to continue throughout the summer into the winter. I think the Russians are going to roll over to bring more reinforcements up to the line than they've been doing already, and then we'll start using the winter like they did last winter to try to choke off the energy and heating. That was a very difficult situation in Kyiv last winter. We were down to about 3 hours of power a day at one point, and I think the Russians will try that again, and it had a very undermining effect in Ukraine. And then I predict, and my predictions so far have been wrong, but I predict by next spring we'll see some sort of acceptance of reality on the battlefield.
And what does that look like? What does that mean? What are Ukraine's objectives, and what were they going to have to, dial back?
Yeah, I think the Ukrainians, if you really talk to the tactical commanders on the ground, they understand this. Not at the Ministry of Defense, they understand. They're going to fight and try to get what they can get this summer. They're going to continue to try to secure the best positions and advantages that they can. And then by next spring, where the lines stand are where I think they'll negotiate for, unfortunately, for Ukraine.
And Andrei, what do you think? And does anyone else come into this negotiation, or is it between Russia and Ukraine? How does this end?
First of all, we need to understand what Russians have organized on the occupied territory of Ukraine. They are attacking people, they're torturing people, raping people, murdering people. This is essentially a huge concentration camp. And if Ukrainians will not be able to sustain this front line without necessary support from the United States and partners, the size of the concentration camp will be larger. Putin will try to do everything possible and impossible to extend the borders of the concentration camp all over Ukraine. And after finishing with that, he would try, not right now, but right after that, but very soon, to extend this concentration camp for new countries. Just remember what he claimed in December 2021 in his two drafts of treaties with the United States and NATO. He wanted to move this border between the Russian sphere of influence and NATO and the West to the 1996 line, with a number of Central European countries under Putin's control. We need to remember that Ukraine is not his last goal. It's only first goal. It's not a first goal. It's just after Chechnya, after Georgia, after Moldova. Ukraine is just one. But after that, there will be new ones. So that is why if United States and Western countries would not stop Putin in Ukraine, on the border of Ukraine, on the international recognized border of Ukraine, Putin will go further. We need to understand it. So with the current level of support, or with the current situation, the war will continue until, from my point of view, until at least January 2025. Why January 2025? This is time of new administration might arrive to the White House. Until the current administration is in White House, this war will continue. The only possibility to change this all recalculations is just arrival in the White House, responsible administration that will take real responsibility for the peace and security in Europe and around the world.
Okay, so last word for you, Will, and especially in terms of NATO and the countries on the border. What does the end look like? What are they hoping for?
Well,
are you asking me?
No, sorry, that's Will's final word.
Coming to me now?
Yes.
Interesting comments by my colleagues. First of all, NATO membership isn't necessary. It doesn't really matter. What matters is that the Russians are defeated because, to go along with another statement of the colleagues, if they're not defeated, this will continue. This is the Russian plan. It is what Russian history says, as I was saying before. And I don't see any reason why it's going to change. I mean, you've got a totally autocratic dictator in charge of Russia, and China too, for that matter. There are two peas in a pod, and it's a rotten pod at the best. And if you can't stand up against that kind of obvious evil, I don't know what you can stand up against. So time for us to have a spine, as some of the generals have said, and to see this thing through. The United States may change. It may get a weaker position. I don't see the war ending. Sorry to say that, but I don't see it because too much blood has been spilled of innocent people.
All right. With that unfortunate note, we're going to have to end the show. Thank you so much to our guest today. Thank you so much for joining us, Andrei Illarionov, James Lechner, and Will Richardson. Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to you and my colleague.
Finally, to all of you brave journalists out there honoring our journalistic golden rule, seek the truth and report it. Thank you. I'm Cindy Drukier, and thank you for joining us on International Reporters Roundtable. Until next time.